I wanted to mention, it was real nice. A viewer, somebody sent in a note. Somebody kept track. They just happened to, they thought maybe I would like to mention it. They pointed out that had I lived today, I would be 96 years old. I was wondering if you would care to have a more direct, plain visitation to a recent Kyroots tale that seemed to strike many people's fancy, which we'll speak about that in private. It was the one that said that the more facts you know, the bigger smartass you can be, and the less facts you know, the more smartasses you can whip. Now, after any possible laughter and tears or even sweat, after that special Kyroot moment, I wondered if any of you had pondered the possibilities after that. The certain, shall we go ahead and say, the certain electrochemical possibilities after that. Not laughs and not attacks on anybody, and etc. But from an electrochemical view, well, first off, to any ordinary mind, anywhere today, we would have to say that, or they would say that having more facts obviously makes one smarter than those without them. But consider, on the other hand, that those who have less and are thereby held less by facts seem less inhibited to move in act-based ways which do not disinclude assault upon the former group. Those of the first noted orientation, that is, fact folks. And amongst other things, I'm sure some of you have already suggested, so I'll go along, that certain civic and social duty we have whenever we can. And one is, it's about time to uncloset a very ugly secret vice that no one wants to talk about, and that is fact bashing. Fact abuse. Fact abuse. Which I guess we could do it in a little more theoretical way. The Kyroots started out on what appeared to be a quite tangible physical basis. That is, that those who have more facts can be bigger smartasses, and those who have less facts can beat up on more of the smartasses. And in a somewhat more theoretical view is what I drug in about this dirty, ugly little vice that has yet to reach the public consciousness. And that is fact abuse. But since it does very little in a practical way to talk in theory, let's go back to the original, that what you have is ordinary people, first off, who have more facts, also have no doubt that they are smarter. They are in a better position than those who do not. That is, you can be a bigger smartass the more facts you have. Back to our crudeness. But the second possibility, those people who have less facts, they have less facts, and also note they have less facts, dash, at least, and are held less by facts, governed by, oriented by, undash, by these facts, at all times seem quite less inhibited, disinclined to act, to move in manners that are act-based as opposed to fact-based, and very specifically, do not exclude physical assault upon the first group. Would you care to turn all this internally? Since I bet somebody around here suspects this got nothing to do with people beating up on each other. But would you care to consider internally how your own fact-based neural activities, thoughts, tend to treat their more act-based relatives? And of course, vice versa, if we wanted to back up. But inside of everyone, in a manner that is not analyzed in this way, it is psychologically noted, it is socially noted, there is an internal relationship that people's thought has with itself. And I don't mean just talking to yourself or just our allegorical pictures of the partnership, which is all true enough. It is the polarized noise that goes through the nervous system called thought. But there is a specific unnoted relationship that people have toward their own thoughts, and what it amounts to is not much less than two different groups of people, two different orientations, of one group being more act-based, primary-based. We got a problem? No. Some, and then you have parts of what would also seem to be just equally as much your own thought processes that are act-based or fact-based and more from the secondary position. For the third time, I'll repeat that no one has ever analyzed it. You do not think about it in this way, but the outcome of it, the manifestations of it, everyone is familiar with. So at least you think that it's too hard to see. Just if you catch a glimpse verbally of what I'm talking about, you realize it is a continual process within everyone at the ordinary street level of thought, is that you have what amounts to one group, one pattern, one basic sets of patterns over in one class that could be described as the smartasses, the fact-based. And you have the other group, the other class of neural activities of a sort that are act-based. And they're the ones that would be inclined to align themselves with the latter group from the Kyroots tale, that is, those who have less and are held less by facts, and coincidentally seem to have very little inhibitions about whipping up on the first group. Since we will assume that none of you have such neurological problems, if there be such, that you actually are having some kind of little fist fights in your brain, although that would explain, I guess, some of the protrusions in certain people's foreheads and temples. But let's assume again that this is not what we're talking about, but you have one group. Perhaps we were to bring it down. You can have a thought that has a particular attitude, never analyzed, but has a particular attitude toward another thought you have. It is a fact-based, a more fact-based thought, having a certain attitude, which is an electrical, chemical relationship, but a certain attitude toward a more act-based thought. The fact-based, if you'll take it now down to the level of a singular thought, is in the same kind of relationship as the chuckle-producing Kyroot. The fact-based thought feels quite superior. It has no doubt whatsoever, and we're not saying that it's unfounded. It is obviously smarter than the thought that is less fact-based. From the second thought's view, if it had such an intellectual view, its attitude is that I could whip you, if it could say that. But the views, the relationship, as in any polarized situation, besides any electrical, physical, mathematical notation you might make their own, to take it back to ordinary psychological everyday descriptions, all such polarized positions have a certain amount of what ordinary people would be inclined to speak of as a certain kind of animosity. Let us, at least, we can do this, be a bit allegorical. And you could say that a positive charge has a certain animosity, a certain confrontational attitude toward a negative charge. There's no way out. If we are now dealing with the flow of electrons in a polarized situation, if we're dealing with what is just ordinarily conceived of to be the physical laws governing magnetism, electrical forces, it's not a question that you're going to take a positive charge and a negative charge and say, now you little rascals, you come here and let's straighten this out. This is not the World Championship Wrestling. You don't have to keep going through all of this. This is not Mike Tyson against George Bush. In some way, we have got to be able to rectify your differences. The differences are not rectifiable. The difference between one who would have more facts and could be more of a smartass, and those who have less facts and therefore can beat up more smartasses, there is no reconcilable difference. There is no operational conflict to be resolved. I was foolish enough a few minutes ago to say that I was sure that some of you would recognize the manifestations of this, if indeed it continued to sound as strange as some of you might have thought. In the beginning, that the manifestation comes out continually, just not under this guise. So now do we back up and hit that? Do you think? All right, let's have a show of hands for you people out there. Everyone raise their hand if you think you have such a situation. And we could say, do you have thoughts of that seem to be inconclusive? And everybody could raise their hand. Do you have thoughts that seem to be unstable? Yes, I do. Do you have thoughts that seem to be self-contradictory? Yes, I do. Do you have thoughts that seem to conflict with other thoughts you have? Yes, I do. All right, back to, let's do it the easy way. Let's ask you again, does anybody think? Okay. You have the situation of neural energy that would seem to be that we can speak of as being emblematic parallel to an individual or an individual thought, but all in here, and that some of them, one of them, at any time, has more facts than the other, is driven more by facts. And it has a certain orientation. It has a certain spatial position in this universe, in your nervous system, easily called, in human terms, an attitude. It is a smartass. It obviously knows more than somebody who knows less. Let's give the language a break. But those that would seem to have less facts, be less driven, held by, governed by, piloted by, navigated by facts, they have their own certain little way of doing things. And one of them is that they have a severe lack of hesitation to whip up on smartasses. Should we allow just everyone's own nervous system to translate in some more efficient and more genteel manner what the nervous system inside of one individual is doing behind the term of me saying that one group, those group or that thought less governed and held by facts has a severe lack of inhibitions over whipping up on the other one. It's fairly crude. What would be a more operational, what would be a more or a less crude way to consider what happens inside the human nervous system when one of these groups, one of these thoughts, is inclined to do what we have been calling whipping the ass of the smart ass? Oh, I don't know. What could we call it? Has anybody ever heard the word ignorance? Most people raise their hand. Most people's heard it. Those of you who haven't, it's not a problem. So there's a certain kind of justice. If you don't know the word ignorance, there is, trust me, there's just almost an elephantine degree of justice involved for those who've never heard the word ignorance. It just all works out. I don't know how, it just all works out. All right, ignorance seems to be either something real or it seems to be a lack of something real. People speak of it without any analyzation anymore. But what would be another way to look at ignorance? And I don't mean just, well, I didn't finish the 12th grade, or no, I don't know much about mathematics. I'm talking about at any time when the human nervous system, when there you are, and it seems that you are being, if not compelled, you are being subtly pushed to act, to move, to do something, if it's just say something in response to something that's been said. That there you are. It's like Jim Henson's hand still up your dress, up your knickers, but it's like his voice went away. You don't know exactly what's happening next. That, let us expand. Let us call that ignorance. At that time, there seems to be a lack of script availability. Sometimes called ambiguity, uncertainty. Where am I? I got a little bit dazed here. Ooh, am I fixing to make a severe fox pass? My tongue won't work. All that. Consider that ignorance. That is a lack, apparently, just of anybody at that particular moment, a lack of certainty as to how I should move. Should I move? What should I do? Should I play? Staring at the headlights of oncoming cars. Should I pretend that I'm suddenly have gone into some kind of post-Pittsburgh syndrome and I'm shell-shocked? Consider it to be a kind of ignorance, to be considered for a second that we've got these two groups, the smartasses and those that want to whip up on the smartasses, and there you stand, and it's like the first group doesn't know exactly what to do, or else they took a coffee break, and you're not sure what to do, and yet you're not in the kind of position that you suddenly want to lash out, which not everybody does, but some people, as you should know, maybe it never made sense to you before, but some people you can say, what's 2 and 2? And they'll punch you in the nose. Now, I guess if you're psychologically inclined, you might later go away and think, especially if somebody jogged you and said, you shouldn't ask Bruno that. You know, his father was a drunk. His mother was a drunk. They all fell out of school. He had to leave school. Bruno was very touchy. He doesn't know what 2 and 2 is. You know. And then if you're a good, ordinary, civilized person, you might go, you know, my jaw is still broken, but you know, in a sense, I can understand. There is somewhere between the instantaneous with ordinary people, even though they'll take credit after the fact if you stop and ask, but being able to instantaneously, there within the few seconds, to react to incoming energy, to either be a smart aleck, that is, a smart ass, have the facts that you apparently do something. They say, what's 2 and 2? And you say, well, 4. Or in what dimension? Anyway, you have something that you don't hesitate, either between that or doing my Bruno bit. They say, what's 2 and 2? You go, you talking to me, or you just hit somebody? All right. In between there is what I want you to consider to be a kind of ignorance, that there would not seem to be the energy available, that you either do not have the facts, and again, remember, we're using facts in the widest possible sense, the same way as ignorance, you know. From one view, we're using facts that's anything within the general realm of thinking of action as opposed to action. or facts being the mother's milk of the secondary world, whereas action would be the same in the primary world. But somewhere in between there would be what I was hoping you would consider in a very wide vista, ignorance. That you can neither come up with the facts, you can neither seem to speak, you can neither seem to fall into a mode of thinking of action, which may be talking of action, that you just can't say anything. That does not seem to be any facts to move you, which is to say the energy is not there to move you, or there does not seem to be the act-based energy to move you. That is, to turn around and just punch somebody, but you don't know what to do next, so you faint, or you wet your pants, or you cry, who knows what. In there, I would suggest, is an area that is not ordinarily analyzed as being ignorance, but it is the momentary inability, apparently, to call upon, to align yourself, to be fed by energy that either makes you fact-based act or act-based act. That at any particular time, in the broadest sense of the term, you cannot either be a smart-ass or be immediately prepared with no hesitation to whip up on smart-asses, including in here, not out there, in here. If you followed into that, and if it were metaphorically metaphorical, then you would have to say, well, that kind of situation could not long be tolerated. Or else we would all be simply staring into the heads of the Peterbilt. Except it either never get here or it always get here. In either case, I assume you understand that you could never get hash browns when you wanted them. That you could never get a coffee refill. Nothing would happen. So what you have is the energy in a polarized situation, once it comes out in humans, that you can see for a very, I suggest, useful reason, temporarily, that people are either operating on the basis of being a smartass or being quite willing, being apparently very uninhibitedly inclined, prepared to whip up on the smartasses. But it has to do, the way that the Kyroots started out, the tale, was those who have more facts are more likely, can better be smartasses. And those who don't can better whip up on those who do. Did no one ever, I was going to sidestep, might as well. It's another place that would seem to be, if you want to see a real battle, we've never pushed it, but some of you should be able to see it. The real battle, from one view, is between psychology and the electrochemical basis of psychology. Now I'm saying psychology in the broadest possible sense. That is, of explaining things in a way that is not limited to, at the very least, it is not limited to the physiology of man, the tangible, physical reality of humans. That's psychology, including anything you want to, religion, sociology, everything. There is a kind of battle that goes on that is not noted. But psychologically, what I'm talking about, is strange as it may have struck some of you, has already been noted a long time ago. How about for the males in the audience? Do we have any males? Raise your hand. How about schoolyard bullies? What could be more down-to-earth, tangible? How many of you have still scars on your knees, behind your ear, over some big old ruffian, probably from out of town, that perhaps wore knickers? It seemed to really irritate him. He had to wear wool underwear, and he used to beat up everybody in the schoolyard. What could be more just everyday, common, and we could go back and analyze and say, well, wait a minute, don't pick on the boy, don't just say he was from out of town, or wait a minute, tell me something about his family, tell me something about his life. I will try to raise the apparent sophisticated, or the level of sophistication of the examples in just a second, but I was going to start as much as we could, pardon me, down in the dirt, because how could you make anything else out of bullies, for instance? And I assume that all you girls have got some idea about that. What could be more mundane, routine, everyday? Don't look beyond psychology. Don't look beyond some kind of non-physical analyzation of what a bully is. I mean, don't tell me there's some kind of metaphorical, much less symbolic significance to a schoolyard bully. I mean, it's just what it is. I mean, you got to discipline the guy. Maybe he needs some drugs. I don't know. Maybe his family beat him. He's got some kind of brain damage. But whatever it is, there can't be any kind of relationship to that and what you're talking about. Sometimes I speak for humanity, ordinary intelligence, and sometimes even I go too far. Right? I mean, don't you want to say, says who? There is a spatialness to thought. The kinds of things we're talking about, schoolyard bullies, beating up on each other, take everyday wisdom, just walking around common sense, much less psychology. Not only has schoolyard bullies been analyzed, dictators, kings, prophets, self-appointed gods, everybody's been analyzed. Even what we're talking about that would appear to be outside the domain of just a single psychotic here and there, the kind of stuff we're talking about has been analyzed in a certain way. But may I repeat, again, there is a spatialness to human thought. For instance, psychology would have already known. Everybody's heard the term normally used in a somewhat negative sense of those kinds of thinkers, members of academia who, here it comes the quote, pass away their time up in ivory towers. Smartasses. Don't get hung in examples, because this is really, really subtle. Is one reason I've never tried to drag any of you through it before. I have not looked up in a handy book about, what do they call them? Since I know most of you gave up all these books that say the origin of interesting terms. Except as several of you pointed out, I don't know anyone that's ever had one of those books that look up a term they wanted that was in there. Don't any of you people that deal in terms write me, unless you're going to send me a book. How about the ivory tower? Couldn't we make it up? Couldn't we surmise where it came from? Well, first off, ivory tower right quick, you can go into Ivy League schools. You can figure that kind of elitist institution wherein you're going to have people dealing in a very theoretical world, and hence that kind of pejorative comment about, well, don't give us advice down here. You're the kind of guy spending your life up there in an ivory tower, which the connotation always being, you don't really know what's going on down here in the real world. Again, I repeat, there is a spatialness to human thought. That's psychological, what I started to say, into the made up on the spot guess about where such a term came from. Well, first off, I guess we are safe with the Ivy League thing. That's always been, I guess, all the way from Oxford and over to the United States and Harvards and everybody. That old kind of old line, big money, Ivy, literally covered. But then why ivory tower? Well, then you can say, well, some of the holdover of classical architecture and neoclassical in England, kind of that they were building turrets and stuff, and maybe some of the professors, I just guess somewhere, that some of the big deans or the dons or whatever, that maybe at some time over at Oxford, let's say, that one of the most out of touch, some great thinker, I won't even guess who. I pick on the British of that era bad enough as it is. But hell, they picked on me first. So we'll assume that there was somebody up there that just got the reputation, deserved or otherwise, of just really being kind of spaced and spooked out by the world of academia, the kind of guy that every time he tried to come down the stairs would trip, fall and hurt himself, come down with his hat on, says, "Anybody seen my hat?" Or he goes over and he starts to eat, and somebody says, "You just ate 5 minutes ago, you just left here," and you go, "Oh." You know, that kind of thing. All right, doesn't that make sense? Doesn't it make sense? There it is. Now, other than if you're collecting tidbits as a hobby, which I'll admit is easier to carry around than the 2x4s from all over the world, what has that told you? Nothing. Nothing. But see, I told you something that didn't strike many of you already, but I'm going to do it for the 4th time, and I may not stop. There is a spatialness to human thought. A spatialness. Now, psychologically, linguistically, but I just went through, let us say that that's the way the thing started, that one professor, Professor X one time, and that it just so happened that his abode, where he lived and did most of his work and studied, was up there, not only in the Ivy School, which is plain enough growing around the school, but it just so happens he was up there and he almost became the British architect of the absent-minded professor, that kind of thing. So there you are. And then it just fell into the language, and now it's just a common kind of attack, observation. That's the kind of guy that just, I know his type. Spent his life in an ivory tower. That is, out of touch. How did that happen? Now, I made it make sense, other than the fact I've said, as I've said before, it doesn't tell you anything, and everybody's still laughing. But I've never stopped there at all. You realize that in some real sense, it tells you nothing. Except nobody can notice that. It's like the merry-go-round. You put your little kid on there, and your little kid, a little chubby nipper, and this the ride you're about to put him on is, where'd the term Ivy League, living in a ivory tower? See, I went from ivy to ivory. I didn't even stop with that because we're running out of time. You got to put all that together. That somebody misspoke. Whoever originally did it went, it's old Dr. So-and-so lives up in the ivory tower, and somebody thought, he said an ivory tower, that's the way it goes. I mean, that's the way. Ask J.B. He wrote several songs that some way got, what he said got truncated somewhere, mispronounced. At any rate, so now it's down to living in an ivory tower. It explains nothing, because if the little nipper, you put him there on the merry-go-round, it's a form of ignorance or a form of inquiry, something you don't know, and it suddenly strikes you, where in the world did that term come from? I've used it, I say it, I hear it, and I know exactly what it means, but where in the world did that come from? So you put him on there, and the music starts, and the horses go up and down, and he goes around, and he comes back, and when he comes back, his story is the one I just made up. About Professor so-and-so, and his room was up there, and he was just so spooked out, just, hardly knew where he was half the time. Brilliant mind in a certain way, all these great ideas, theoretical ideas, and a lot of them have been useful later, but not, during his lifetime, the man was just a walking disaster. So the little nipper comes back, and you take him off, and that's the story. And you think, well, that's interesting. And you and the nipper walk off, but do you understand nothing's happened? Not from any revolutionist sense. He just went around and came back, and you went, oh, that's very interesting. But what does that tell you? Now, this is what's hard, except for a few people. I can't prove it. I certainly can't preach on it, but I'm just going to point out again that from a subversive way, a real revolutionist has got to be able to hear this once and for all. It doesn't tell you anything, except in the sense that it tells you everything. Well, yeah, well, that makes sense to me. What else do you want? You're right, you got me again. But for the rest of you, you do understand it doesn't tell you anything. Except stuff, facts. How about even more so? It's not even just the terms part, but how about the way that it has functionally turned out in civilized life in structures that have height to them. Who gets the upper stories? Management. The big shots. Everybody knows that if you're going up and it's the first national building, the first national corporation's home headquarters, and you're going to see the president, you know damn well, you never think about it, but you don't go into the lobby and just think, well, there's no doubt I'll match the basement because that's where he is. Chances are you're not even going to look, unless you know for a fact there may be a penthouse or something going on. You just assume he's either on the top or right at the top. It's just a known, everybody accepts it. It's going to be the lower stories, nobody even thinks about it. If some of you follow this, the company has this whole building. The more you're dealing with those who are dealing with facts, those in power, the smarter, those above the blue, even white-collar workers, the big guys, the smart asses, are up. Now think about it. And at first you might say, well, what the hell do they think about that? It's just the way things are. A real revolutionist doesn't take that attitude. Oh, I know, a real revelation doesn't take any attitude. But that isn't anything. How does this happen? Fifth time. I'll back up. There is a spatialness to human thought. I didn't say anything about psychology, and I didn't say anything about the sociological ramifications of architecture and height as is worked out in the American workplace, which I could go from there and show how it ends up that the big shots are up there. If that was too vague, I could even speak for psychology or social critics and even go further and say, wait a minute, there is a little something even beyond that, because the smarter you are, let's just take it. Let's be honest now. I'm speaking for ordinary people. They could say the smarter you are in a sense, no offense meant, but in a sense, you are sort of looking down. No offense, but in a sense, you're kind of looking down. I mean, if the obligation of the noble in the intellectual sense, that here I am, I was blessed by being born in a certain part of the country, in a certain family. I had a certain education. And it's no offense to those who must clean out our buildings, the janitors, those that work on the elevators and the air conditioning. It's no offense. But compared to my position, thank God, in a sense, I sort of have to, sort of look after them. But to actually say that in a sense you sort of look down on them, no offense meant, you would have to say, yes, there's some validity. So by God, put the nipper back in the merry-go-round, we finally explained it, right? What? Well, those that are in charge, those that have some power, the king, even the smartest people, those that have more experience in the business, there is something just I'm speaking for ordinary people now, there's something almost just inherently, physically, tangible at work that makes those in charge, those that have more facts, those that are more intelligent, it's just, I can't imagine it. They've got to be up in the higher areas of the building. Something is not right. You would not put the janitors, all of just the blue-collar people that keep the building up. Couldn't do without them, but you're not going to put them up there and have the big shots in the basement or even the first floor, but especially the basement. It's almost inconceivable. Why? There is a spatialness to thought, because thought is electrical energy. And electrical energy is a spatial creature. It is not psychological. Well, you could say that the psychological aspect of it, as it's called, is like an overcoat, a mackinaw, underwear, socks, a scarf. It's a piece of it. And you can stick your question on a merry-go-round, and you can wait for it to come back, and it may come back and say, well, story of Professor so-and-so, where you started up, living, out of touch, a real smart-ass, I think is what you meant originally, living up in an ivory tower too far removed from the everyday demands of the real world. Or, as you put it, the capital, management, the way they raise themselves above the workers, those that make the building run, those that actually make the products down there in the basement and the lower stories. Yeah, they get up there. I don't know. There's something about it looking down and feeling superior. Yeah, that explains it. Yeah. As all of you know, it's no attack on psychology. But you should see, and I'm just picking out psychologists. Sometimes we pick on other people, remember. Sometimes, religion or Amway. But tonight, let's use psychology. Hey, let's don't get started on Amway. In a sense, you could take ordinary people like me trying to prove a point. We've been through this. If ordinary intelligence would go far enough, which it ordinarily can't, it would see that psychology and everything else gets to where it seems to be a reasonable answer that the merry-go-round came around and the nipper's hollering, ah, ah, so you take it off. Or else you lose interest. You close the book you read that says, here's where the idea of living in an ivory tower. And so the kid comes around, you either read it, you look off and you think, well, it's either yes, I take it, or no, I don't. But it's, ah, ah, so you, one way or the other. Listen, here it is, psychology and everything else in the secondary world. Is that psychology can never find seminal events to explain it. The closer they would come, they'd get stuck with, wait a minute, we're going to have to go back to some kind of idea of a God or some kind of original event. And they can't do that. Not because psychology can't do it, but because the polarized mind can't do it. It can never go back to the start, which is part of the intrigue of physics and astronomy, trying to look for the first second. Push back our understanding, push back even our visual and otherwise outside the electromagnetic spectrum to even look further and further into the past and closer to the big boom, the big seminal event. The reason why did the big shots, the smart asses, get up higher? Don't give me psychological reasons. There are none. Well, there are, but they do not refer back to a seminal event, because you've got to say, well, something started. Yeah, what started that? The sins of the father. Oh, I'm sorry, psychology, not the sins. The drunkenness of the father caused the drunkenness of the son. Well, wait a minute. How about the old man himself? Well, he's dead. Yeah, but if he was here, what would you say? Well, I wouldn't. As a matter of fact, we check back. His father was a drunk. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. Well, how about his grandfather then? All you got is a continuation that's known as, what do they call it? Generations. Of the kid keep coming around, and he screams, and you take him off, and you think, well, why not? Unless there was some real extraordinary smart ass like some of you saying, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't explain a thing. If his father made him do it, wait, put that kid back on the merry-go-round and tell him to go and find out why his father did that. And the kid comes back and he says, well, his father did it. Put him on again. So he comes back. You go stand there the rest of your life. And the kid keeps coming back. Well, if you're ordinary, the people are going to stand around you. You're going to say, would you get out of the way? You don't make sense to us. The kid came back and he said, hey, I found out his father made him do it. And you'd be surrounded, forget about out there, how about in here, with your smart aleck, your smart ass information that says, wait a minute, we've answered that. Whew. We're absolutely out of time, right? Bye. Just think if you were alive today, how old you would be.